Snow did not fall that day. It would come later when the season turned cruel and the mountain began its judgment. For now, late summer still held Ravens Creek in its grip. The air carried the smell of fresh-cut pine wagon grease and sawdust, warming under a sun that had not yet learned mercy. Eleanor Brennan stood at the narrow window of the worker shack, one hand resting on the sill her mother had taught her to read for rot. The wood held firm. Everything else in Ravens Creek was starting to give way. She had hung a clean towel by that window 3 years earlier, the day they moved into this place. Not because the window deserved decoration, because a home needed one small thing that said someone cared about it. The towel hung there, still faded now, washed every Sunday in water she carried from the creek below the mill yard. Above the cast iron stove, apple slices dried on cords she had strung herself. The fruit came from a tree behind the foreman's house windfalls. He would have let rot if Eleanor had not asked permission to gather them. Waste offended her in ways most people never understood. Her mother had taught her that nothing given by the land should be discarded without thought. The table had been scrubbed so many times the grain showed white in places. Eleanor ran her palm across it each morning before setting out bread or porridge, feeling for splinters that might catch small hands. Willa was 6 now, old enough to help with simple tasks, but young enough to move carelessly. Caleb 8 watched everything with the serious attention of a boy trying to understand how the world held together. They were not prosperous. They would never be prosperous. But Eleanor Brennan had learned long ago that poverty and disorder were not the same thing. A woman could be poor and still keep her family from falling into chaos. Outside, Thaddeus worked the wagon yard. She could hear the rhythm of it even from here. The strike of hammer on wheel rim, the scrape of metal on wood, the low voices of men solving problems with their hands instead of their mouths. Her husband was good at that work, patient, methodical. He blocked beams under loads that shifted wrong-hauled chain through mud and stone-strapped broken wheels back into service. The foreman liked men who arrived early and worked steady. Thaddeus Brennan was that kind of man. He came home tired most evenings, but he came home useful. Eleanor had married him for that steadiness, and she had never regretted it. What she had not expected was how quickly useful could turn into not enough. The shack leaned slightly when rain soaked the ground. It rattled when freight wagons passed too fast on the main road. The roof leaked in 2 places Eleanor had marked with buckets. The door hung crooked. The floorboards near the stove had started to soften from moisture that came up through the earth. Still, it had been theirs, or near enough to theirs that the difference had not mattered. Until the letter came. Eleanor saw it first slipped under the door while Thaddeus was still at the yard. Plain paper. No envelope. The kind of message that did not waste money on formality because the content was not meant to be kind. She read it standing in the doorway, one hand still on the latch. The row of worker shacks beside the mill yard had been sold forward into winter use. The owner wanted the land cleared before cold set in. A storage house would go up where families were sleeping now. Men without wives could bunk elsewhere. Men with families were expected to solve themselves. Notice came late. Too late for kindness to matter. Eleanor folded the paper once and set it on the table. She did not sit down. Sitting felt like surrender, and she was not ready for that yet. When Thaddeus came home that evening, she handed him the letter without preamble. He read it twice. The second time, his lips moved slightly, as if speaking the words aloud might change their meaning. "How long?" he asked. 3 weeks. He set the letter down. "I'll ask around." Eleanor nodded. She had already begun calculating in her head. 3 weeks meant 18 days of real searching after accounting for Sundays when no business opened. 18 days to find a place that would take a family of 4 cost less than they could afford, and remain standing through the winter that was already sharpening its teeth in the high country. The odds were not good. Thaddeus went door to door the next morning before dawn. He asked the rate. He asked the terms. He thanked people even when the answer had already closed before it was spoken. One boarding house refused children outright. The keeper did not even let Thaddeus finish the question. No young ones. They break things and spread sickness. House rule. A loft above the saloon was available if a family could live over spilled liquor. Shouting and midnight boots on stairs. Eleanor said no before Thaddeus finished explaining the offer. She had watched what happened to children raised in the noise above drinking houses. They learned the wrong rhythms. They grew up thinking chaos was normal. There was another place farther south, but hauling their goods there and paying entry costs would swallow nearly every dollar they had saved. And the landlord there had a reputation for raising rent, without warning once a family settled. Each evening, Thaddeus came back with less hope and more weariness in his face. On the 5th day, Eleanor took matters into her own hands. She walked the town herself, Willa's small hand in hers, Caleb trailing behind with the quiet watchfulness he had inherited from his father. She did not ask for housing directly. Instead, she listened. She stood near the dry goods counter and heard 2 women mention a family moving east. She sat on a bench outside the feed store and learned which landlords were decent and which were not. She visited the seamstress, who sometimes hired her for mending work, and asked careful questions about who might be leaving before winter. She stopped by the church and spoke with the pastor's wife, who kept track of such things. By the end of the week, Eleanor knew what Thaddeus had already discovered through his own searching. There was nothing available they could afford, nothing suitable for children, nothing that would not strip them of every reserve they had built. The town was growing too fast. Rooms filled faster than families could find them. Roofs rose faster than wages did. And people without options were expected to make themselves disappear quietly. Eleanor Brennan was many things, but quiet in the face of injustice was not one of them. She had been raised by a woman who understood frontier life in ways most people had forgotten. Her mother had taught her to read land the way others read books, to notice how water moved, where wind struck hardest, which trees grew tallest and why, how to preserve food without waste, how to stretch supplies when winter came early. Her mother had survived 2 harsh seasons alone after Eleanor's father died, keeping herself and a young daughter alive in a cabin 20 miles from the nearest town. She had done it without complaint, without drama, without expecting rescue. Eleanor had learned every lesson her mother taught, and the most important lesson had been this: when the world offers you no good choices, you make your own. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, not the eviction notice. That had already done its damage. This was different. An official envelope with a county seal, the kind of mail that carried weight. Eleanor opened it at the table while Thaddeus was washing up after work. Caleb and Willa were outside playing in the small patch of dirt behind the shack where nothing grew but weeds and hope. Inside the envelope were 3 things: a deed, a map, and a letter written in handwriting she did not recognize. The deed named her Eleanor Brennan, formerly Eleanor Mercer, heir to one Silas Mercer, recently deceased, whose claim to a parcel of land on the eastern side of Bramble Ridge now passed to his surviving blood kin. The map was rough, hand-drawn, the kind of guide made by someone who knew the land but did not care about impressing cartographers. It showed a ridgeline, a notch between peaks, a spring marked with a simple X, and near the bottom, in the same careful handwriting as the letter, a note: cabin at the stone pocket. Look for the seam. Eleanor stared at those words. Look for the seam. She had never met Silas Mercer. Her mother had mentioned him once or twice, always in passing, always with a tone that suggested complicated family history best left unexamined. An uncle, or great-uncle, some distant branch of the family tree that had grown apart from the main trunk long before Eleanor was born. But the deed was legal. The county clerk had certified it, and according to the transfer documents, Silas Mercer had died 8 weeks earlier with no wife living, no children near enough in law to claim what remained. By blood and record, Eleanor Brennan stood close enough to inherit. The letter was the third piece, a single sheet of plain paper, folded once, the handwriting slow and square and deliberate. Eleanor read it aloud, her voice steady. To whoever inherits. If you are reading this, you have frontier blood. Your mother knew things most people have forgotten. She would have taught you to read the land before you read a book, to watch where water flows, to build for weather instead of appearance. Men will judge you from where they stand. Wind and snow will judge you where you stand. Choose which judgment matters. The room went quiet after that. Thaddeus dried his hands on a rag and sat down across from her. He did not reach for the papers. He waited. Eleanor read the letter again, then once more in silence. She understood what Silas Mercer was saying. More than that, she recognized the truth in it. Her mother had taught her exactly those things. To notice how moss grew thicker on the north side of trees, to mark where deer trails crossed, to observe which slopes held snow longest and which sheds it fastest. She had thought those lessons were simply the practical knowledge of a woman who lived far from towns. Now she understood they were something else, a kind of inheritance that could not be written into deeds or sealed by county clerks. It's land, Thaddeus said quietly, with a cabin. Eleanor nodded. Up on Bramble Ridge. She nodded again. We've never seen it. No. Thaddeus looked at the map, then at the deed, then at his wife. Could be nothing. Could be a ruin. Could be a hole in the ground Silas called a cabin, to make himself feel better about living in it. Eleanor met his eyes. Could be. Could be dangerous for the children. Could be. Winter's coming. If we go up there and it's not livable, we'll have no time to find something else. Eleanor folded the letter carefully along its original crease. And if we stay here, we have 18 days to find something we already know does not exist. Thaddeus said nothing. He was a practical man. He understood numbers. Eleanor placed the letter on top of the deed and slid both toward him. Silas Mercer built something up there, something he thought was worth leaving to family. He wrote that letter knowing whoever inherited would face exactly the choice we're facing now. You think he knew? Thaddeus said. It was not quite a question. I think he understood what happens to people without options. Thaddeus picked up the map and studied it in the lamplight. The lines were crude but clear. A trail marked from Raven's Creek north toward Widow's Notch. A ridge line running east, a spring, a stone pocket. "Your mother ever mentioned this place?" he asked. "No, but she mentioned Silas once. Said he was the kind of man who did not need other people to tell him he was right." Thaddeus set the map down. That could mean stubborn, or it could mean wise. They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, Caleb called to Willa about something small and unimportant. A child's voice carrying the simple joy of a day that had not yet taught them to worry. Finally, Thaddeus spoke. "If we go together. Your decision carries as much weight as mine." Eleanor had known he would say that. It was one of the reasons she had married him. He understood partnership in ways many men did not. She looked at the letter again, at the line that mattered most. "Your mother knew things most people have forgotten." Eleanor Brennan folded her hands on the table and spoke clearly. "Your hands can fix what breaks. Mine can read what the land is saying. Together we go." Thaddeus nodded once. The decision was made. What neither of them expected was how quickly the town would turn that decision into entertainment. Word traveled faster than wagons in Ravens Creek. By the next afternoon, men at the yard were grinning over it. Thaddeus Brennan was taking his family to some hidden shack on Bramble Ridge, a place no one could even see from the road. But the sharper mockery was aimed at Eleanor. She heard it herself 2 days later when she went to the general store for salt. 3 women stood near the counter talking just loudly enough to be overheard. "Taking children into wilderness," one of them said. "Not even a proper house from what I heard." "A woman's folly," another added. "Should let her husband make decisions about shelter." The third woman, older than the other 2, shook her head slowly. "Men go where work is. Women should keep families safe. Leading them into the mountains when winter's coming. That's not a wife's place." Eleanor bought her salt without comment. She thanked the shopkeeper. She walked out with her head high and her face calm. But the words followed her home. The worst came from Nolan Pike. He was a freight hauler who had crossed winter roads enough times to have earned respect among the men who worked cargo. He knew weight. He knew weather. He knew which trails turned lethal when snow came, and which ones only pretended to be safe. Thaddeus was loading tools into the wagon when Nolan walked over, hands deep in his coat pockets, face set in the expression of a man about to deliver hard truth. "Heard you're taking your family up to Widow's Notch," Nolan said. "Near there," Thaddeus replied. "East side of Bramble Ridge. To that rock pocket Silas Mercer holed up in." "That's right." Nolan looked past Thaddeus to where Eleanor was wrapping dishes in cloth, preparing them for travel. He raised his voice just enough to make sure she could hear. "Taking children into a badger den. And your wife's idea, from what I understand." Thaddeus straightened. "It's our idea. A woman leading a family into wilderness." Nolan shook his head. "I've seen how this ends. Only one way it ever ends." Eleanor stopped rapping. She turned to face Nolan Pike directly. He met her eyes without apology. "Ravens Creek has a cemetery, Mrs. Brennan. It's full of people who made choices like yours." Eleanor held his gaze. Her voice came out steady and cold. "Then we'll be in good company with all the others who refuse to beg." Nolan's expression did not change. Stubbornness is not the same as wisdom. Neither is fear, Eleanor said. She turned back to her work. The conversation was over, but Nolan's words joined the others circling like crows over a field. They packed the wagon over 3 days. Everything they owned fit into it, and even then the bed still had room. A few wooden boxes, rolled blankets, tools wrapped in burlap, flour enough for careful use, salt pork enough for less than comfort. A water barrel Thaddeus had patched twice. The cast iron skillet Eleanor's mother had given her, blackened by years of suppers. Her sewing tin with needles, thread, and buttons saved from garments already worn past use. Caleb's primer book soft at the corners from reading. Willa's strip of red cloth, no use to anyone except the child who slept easier when it was near. A family could be measured by what it carried when forced to move. Eleanor looked at the wagon bed and saw not poverty but intention. Everything there served a purpose. Nothing had been packed for sentiment alone, though sentiment rode along with the practical. Ravens Creek watched them leave with mixed faces. Some men offered nods heavy with pity. Others smirked openly. One called after Thaddeus, asking if badgers' charge ran up on the ridge. Another asked whether snow buried children faster than grown folk. Eleanor climbed onto the wagon seat beside her husband. Caleb and Willa sat in the back among the boxes and blankets, watching the only town they had ever known fall away behind them. Thaddeus took the reins and never looked back. The road toward Widow's Notch had once been passable enough for timber wagons. Time and neglect had reduced it to memory with ruts. Saplings stood where wheels had turned. Grass grew through old tracks. Rockfall had eaten half the grade in places, forcing careful passage one wheel at a time. By noon, the air had changed. Valley warmth thinned behind them. The mountain carried the smell of wet wood, cold pine, and stone that lost heat early. Sound traveled differently there. Sharper, shorter. As if the mountains took words and clipped their edges before letting them settle. Caleb studied the rising slopes and finally asked the question children save until they can no longer hold it. Is it really a house? Thaddeus kept his eyes on the trail. A house can mean many things. A home is where your people make it through the first night. Caleb considered that like a lesson meant to last. Willa said nothing. She sat pressed against Eleanor, red cloth in hand, watching the cliffs climb higher through the wagon rails. Eleanor reached down and rested her hand on her daughter's head. The girl leaned into the touch. Some comfort required no words. Every turn took them farther from the world that judged by appearance. Every mile carried them closer to the one that judged by endurance. By late afternoon, they reached the place named on the deed and saw no house at all, only a long wall of gray stone rising from the slope, cold and blunt, backed by a stand of dark pine. Old water stains ran down the face of it in pale streaks, where seasons had spilled and dried. Wind moved across the ridge with enough bite to remind them dusk would come fast. The wagon stopped. No one climbed down at first. Thaddeus looked from the map to the stone and back again. He frowned. The map clearly marked this spot, but there was nothing here except rock and pine and the kind of silence that made a person feel small. Eleanor sat very still. Her eyes moved slowly across the stone face, not searching wildly, observing, reading. Willa gripped the red cloth tighter. Caleb shifted in the wagon bed, trying to see what his mother was seeing. Thaddeus finally spoke. Could be the map's wrong. Could be we missed a turn. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She was watching the way fern growth bent flatter in one section than the plants beside it, noticing how moss grew thicker, in a narrow band than the dampness around it should have allowed, marking where the stone surface stayed drier than nearby rock despite the heavy air. Her mother's voice came back to her across the years. Land does not lie. People misread it. But the land itself tells the truth to anyone willing to look. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon. Thaddeus reached for her arm, but she was already moving toward the stone wall. Eleanor. She held up one hand, not dismissive, just asking for silence. She walked along the base of the wall slowly, one palm brushing rock eyes narrowing at every seam and shadow. She crouched near a patch of earth packed firmer than chance would make it, as if feet had crossed there long ago, many times, then stopped. Caleb stayed quiet now. Willa held Thaddeus's hand tighter. Even the mules seemed to sense the stillness of a place waiting to be understood. Eleanor moved along the wall, reading it the way she had been taught, not looking for what should be there, looking for what was. Then she stopped. Between two narrow shoulders of stone darkness held a different shape than the cracks around it, not wide enough for a broad man to walk straight through, narrow, almost hidden. But there, more important than size was the air. Out on the slope, wind cut sharp and moving. Here, from that slit in the rock, it breathed cold but standing. No slicing edge, no rush, just air that had found a place to rest. Eleanor leaned closer. There it was, old wood, dry earth, ash that had slept a long time. Not animal musk, not rot, not a hollow left empty by weather. Something human had lived behind that stone and taught the space how to keep itself. Eleanor placed one hand on each side of the narrow opening and looked back at her family. "We found the door," she said. Thaddeus climbed down from the wagon, disbelief and hope fighting for space on his face. Caleb and Willa scrambled after him. Eleanor turned sideways and entered first, moving carefully through the gap. The slit in the rock narrowed for 3 steps, then widened suddenly into stillness. She took one more pace and stopped. Behind the seam was a natural recess cut deep into the mountain itself. Rock rose left and right like built walls. Above, a heavy shelf of stone pushed forward over the hollow like a great brow catching what weather came hardest from above and west. The place did not feel dug. It felt chosen. And 18 feet back in that sheltered pocket stood the cabin. Low, dark, quiet. Its front was so close in color to the surrounding stone and shadow that from any wrong angle outside a man could stare straight at it and never know it was there. No bright boards, no proud chimney line reaching high, no porch made for admiration. It had not been made to be admired. It had been made not to be found by wind. Thaddeus came through next, one hand on the rock, eyes adjusting to the dim. Caleb followed close behind. Then Willa, who stepped in and stopped so suddenly she nearly sat down where she stood. None of them spoke at first. Some discoveries are too strange to cheer for immediately. They must be understood before they can be loved. The front of the cabin faced southeast, open enough to catch morning light turned away from the worst hammering blows of northwest winter wind. The roof sat low and sensible, sloped just enough to shed weight, without offering the sky too much edge to seize. Sod covered most of it, stitched through with mountain moss. Beneath one worn eave-line, strips of old birch bark still showed where water had once been told to keep moving. Stone shoulders guarded both sides. Even the ground before the door sat lower in drift lines, suggesting storms passed over this pocket differently than they did the exposed slope beyond. Caleb whispered, "It's hiding." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No. It's staying." Thaddeus stepped farther forward, studying the mouth of the hollow, the roof line, the angle of the entrance. The still air resting there while wind hissed faintly outside. He did not call it lucky. He did not call it pretty. He said the only thing a builder could say when confronted with work that outlasted its maker. Someone understood weather. Eleanor moved toward the cabin door. It did not sag. The hinges were old, but sound. She lifted the latch, leaned her shoulder once, and the door gave way inward. Warmth was not waiting there, but order was. The main room measured roughly 16 feet by 22, low enough to hold heat when heat came, high enough for a person to work without stooping. Every inch had been spent carefully. Along one wall stood 2 rough bunks, built stout instead of handsome. A plain table sat near the center. 2 benches. Shelving fixed high where damp could not climb easily. Pegs along beams for coats, tools, bundles, rope. At the far side rested a low masonry hearth, set partly into stone. Its throat narrowed before rising into a rear flue chimney, built back through rock instead of proudly up through open roof. Eleanor understood immediately. Silas Mercer had cared less about smoke being seen than heat being kept. There were sealed boxes, dry barrels. A draw knife hung oiled. A hand auger wrapped in cloth. Spare wedges, pegs, and iron pieces sorted by size. Nothing rich. Nothing wasted. This was not the cabin of a drifter. It was the workshop of someone who intended to survive repeatedly. But it was the household details that made Eleanor's breath catch. Food storage elevated above the floor on simple racks. Clay vessels arranged by size near the hearth. A water barrel positioned where it would not freeze but would stay cool. Shelves built at the exact height where a woman could reach without straining. Every choice showed thinking beyond mere construction. Thaddeus moved to the hearth and knelt. "I'll get kindling." Eleanor walked the perimeter slowly. She pressed her fingertips against the wall seams, oakum, fine clay. Something that felt like dried fur worked into gaps between the logs. Whoever had sealed this place understood drafts as enemies. She found the second note tucked into a gap between 2 shelving boards. The paper had yellowed but remained dry. The handwriting matched the letter from the deed packet. Eleanor unfolded it carefully and read aloud. "Whoever reads this, you have your mother's eyes for shelter. Trust what you learned at her knee, not what men at the road say. Build small. Seal tight. Let weather pass over instead of through. Keep fire humble. Store high. Waste nothing. And remember this, a home is not the walls. It is the people the walls protect." Her voice caught on the last line. Thaddeus looked up from where he was arranging kindling in the hearth. "What is it?" Eleanor handed him the note. He read it twice. Then he looked around the cabin again with new understanding. "Silas built this for someone like you. he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. She could not speak yet. Caleb had found the hand tools and was studying them with reverence. Willa stood near the table, one small hand resting on the wood as if asking permission. Thaddeus struck flint. Sparks caught. One piece of kindling began to smoke, then flame. He fed it carefully, adding small pieces until the fire gathered itself. They all watched the chimney. Smoke rose, tightened through the narrow throat, and disappeared cleanly. No spill back, no choke, no wandering haze. Thaddeus sat back on his heels. Draws perfect. Eleanor moved to the hearth and knelt beside him. She held her hands toward the small flame, not for warmth yet, but for the confirmation of it. Fire meant life. Smoke rising clean meant the system worked. "We're not trespassing on a dead man's work," she said softly. "We're continuing it." Thaddeus placed another piece of wood on the fire. "You knew, didn't you? When you decided to come, you knew this would be here." "I hoped," Eleanor corrected. "Silas understood the same things my mother understood. I hoped that meant he built the way she would have built." "And if you'd been wrong," Eleanor met his eyes, "then we would have been wrong together." Outside, the stone pocket wind still moved along the ridge, but inside the cabin held still and quiet. The fire crackled. Shadows moved across the walls in steady orange pulses. They ate their first meal there at the plain table Silas Mercer had left behind. Salt pork cut thin to make it seem more than it was. Flour stirred into a loose mash with water from the barrel. Thaddeus had carried in from the wagon. Hot water poured slow and grateful into tin cups. No feast. Yet no meal in Raven's Creek had tasted quite like it. This one was eaten under a roof no landlord could reclaim by morning, under walls that belonged to them not by monthly payment, but by blood and inheritance, and the kind of frontier wisdom that could not be bought or sold. After supper, Eleanor wiped the table clean and spread the deed beneath the oil lamp Thaddeus had lit. The paper looked no finer than it had in town. Same seal, same stiff language, same lines and signatures. But meaning can change when placed on the right table. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Brennan possessed something that could not be loaded onto a wagon and hauled away when someone else decided they wanted the space, land, stone, position. Shelter rooted where it stood. Caleb leaned over the page without understanding law, but understanding importance. Willa rested half asleep against Eleanor's side, red cloth, still in hand. Thaddeus looked from the deed to the rock walls, then to the steady fire. Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand over his for a moment. No speech followed it. None was needed. They had made it through the first night. That was how homes began, not with certainty, not with comfort, not with the approval of people who measured worth by how things looked from the road. Homes began when a family stood together in a place and decided the ground beneath them mattered more than the opinions behind them. Eleanor Brennan folded the deed carefully and set it aside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, leaks to find, systems to test, wood to cut, winter preparations to finish before the season turned. But tonight the cabin held. The fire burned clean. The children slept safe. and somewhere in the shadows the ghost of Silas Mercer rested, knowing his work had found the right hands to carry it forward. Eleanor rose and moved to the small window near the door. Through the narrow opening she could see a slice of darkening sky, stars beginning to emerge, the ridgeline black against deep blue. Behind her, Thaddeus banked the fire for the night. Caleb and Willa had already climbed into one of the bunks, the red cloth tied to the frame above them. This was not the life Eleanor had imagined when she married Thaddeus Brennan. She had not dreamed of hidden cabins or mountain ridges or frontier inheritance. But her mother had taught her something more important than dreams. She had taught her to recognize truth when it presented itself, to read the land honestly, to build for what was real instead of what looked good from a distance. And standing in that stone pocket surrounded by walls that had been waiting for someone who understood them, Eleanor knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had not fled to this place in desperation. They had come home to something that had been waiting for them all along. The wind outside whispered against stone. Inside, the fire settled into coals. And Eleanor Brennan, daughter of a frontier woman who had survived alone, wife to a steady man, mother to 2 children, who were learning what it meant to belong somewhere, closed her eyes and let herself feel something she had not felt in years. Not hope. Hope was too fragile. This was something stronger. Recognition. The understanding that she stood exactly where she was meant to be, not because fate had placed her there, but because she had read the signs correctly and chosen the hard path over the easy lie. The mountain had not welcomed them with warmth or comfort, but it had given them something more valuable, a place to prove themselves. And Eleanor Brennan had never backed down from a test in her life. The mountain did not reward them with ease. 3 days after they arrived, cold rain came mixed with early meltwater, sliding off the stone shelf above the hollow. Eleanor heard it before she saw it. A new tapping along the roof edge, then a slower drip where no drip belonged. She rose from the table where she had been sorting dried beans and moved to the back corner of the cabin. There, a dark patch creeping along the lower wall where water had found a weakness too small to see and too real to ignore. 2 old water paths, long quiet, had remembered themselves. They ran down the rock face, kissed the eave line, and worked toward that corner like patient enemies. Water never needs much of an invitation. Thaddeus was outside within minutes. Eleanor stood in the doorway watching him search the slope above the cabin. He found the shallow trench Silas had once cut, and time had half filled. Grass and small stones had clogged it. The water had simply gone around, following the path of least resistance, straight toward the cabin wall. Eleanor stepped out into the rain. Not there. Thaddeus looked up from where he was already starting to dig. The trench runs this way. Water wants to flow southeast. Eleanor pointed to a line invisible to anyone who had not been taught to read slope and stone. Silas designed for that. If you deepen it where you're standing, you'll just push the problem 10 feet over. Thaddeus straightened rain dripping from his hat brim. He trusted his wife's reading of land more than he trusted his own assumptions. Show me. Eleanor walked the slope slowly, one hand trailing along the stone face. She stopped at a point 8 feet from where Thaddeus had been digging. Here. The rock shelf angles this direction. See how the moss line changes. Thaddeus looked. The moss grew thicker to the left of where she stood, thinner to the right. A person who did not know better would miss it entirely. But Eleanor's mother had taught her that moss told stories about water movement if you paid attention. "If we cut here," Eleanor continued, "and angle it to meet the old trench downstream, the water will follow its natural path. It won't fight us." Thaddeus nodded once. He repositioned and began digging where his wife had indicated. Eleanor returned to the cabin, stripped off her wet shawl, and went back to sorting beans. Caleb watched her from the table. "How did you know?" "My mother taught me to watch where things want to go instead of where we think they should go." Eleanor set aside a handful of beans that had started to shrivel. Water flows downhill, but it also flows towards certain textures of earth. Clay holds it. Sand passes it. Moss grows where it lingers. Why didn't Papa see it? Because he was looking for the problem. I was looking for what the land was trying to tell us. By dusk, the corner was dry. Thaddeus had cut the trench to nearly 14 inches deep, lined the first stretch with flat stones so runoff would keep moving instead of chewing earth loose again. He drove fresh pegs through loose sod at the roof edge and reset what weather had lifted. Eleanor brought him hot water in a tin cup when he came inside. He drank it without sitting down, too tired to do anything but stand and let warmth work its way through him. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. Eleanor took the empty cup. "She would say we have not earned pride yet, only survived one rain." That night the fire burned low and steady. Willa slept with her red cloth tied to the bunk frame. Caleb lay awake longer than usual thinking about water and moss and the difference between looking at a problem and listening to what the land said about it. Eleanor sat near the hearth, mending a shirt by lamplight. Thaddeus oiled the hinges on the door and checked the seal around the frame. Neither spoke much. The cabin had taught them that silence was not emptiness. Sometimes it was just two people working in the same direction without needing to announce it. But 3 nights later, another lesson arrived. The wind changed quarter and struck the hollow from a harder angle than it had before. Smoke that had drawn clean for days hesitated in the narrow throat of the chimney. It rolled once, then pushed back into the room in a gray cough. It lasted only moments. Moments were enough. Eleanor snatched Willa from the bench and stepped away from the hearth. Caleb covered his mouth and blinked through the sting. Thaddeus moved to the door and threw it open, adjusting the draft. He fed less fuel to the fire, watched the flow recover. When the room cleared, Eleanor set Willa down gently, but did not return to her seat. She stood near the door, one hand on the frame, looking at her husband with the steady eyes of someone who needed more than reassurance. "I am not afraid of being poor," she said. Her voice carried no anger, only truth that had been building for days. "I am afraid of raising children who forget what other people sound like." Thaddeus set down the fire poker. "We're not that far from town. We are a day's travel from the nearest voice that is not our own. Martha Keene is closer than that." Eleanor shook her head. "I do not even know where Martha Keene lives. We have heard her name. We have not heard her voice." The fear she named was not the one Thaddeus had been watching for. He had worried about leaks and cold and whether the cabin would hold through winter. Eleanor had been worrying about something different. Isolation was not the same as solitude. Solitude could be chosen. Isolation was what happened when choice ran out and the world narrowed to 4 walls and the same 3 faces every day. Children needed to see how other people lived. They needed to hear different voices. They needed to understand that the world contained more than one way of doing things. Thaddeus crossed the room and stood before his wife. "What do you need?" Eleanor looked past him to where Caleb and Willa were watching with the alertness children develop when adult conversations turn serious. "I need to know we are not alone up here." The next morning, Eleanor laid out what remained of their supplies on the table. Flour, salt pork, beans, lamp oil, coffee stretched thin enough to be memory if used carefully. If no weather trapped them, if no sickness deepened, they had less than 3 weeks before another trip to town became necessity instead of choice. Thaddeus listened and nodded once. Numbers deserved respect. But there was another problem. He could not spend full days back at the mill yards even if work waited there. The cabin still needed ceiling drainage maintenance woodcut, and winter measures finished before true cold arrived. A place half prepared in October could become a grave by January. Eleanor understood the calculation without needing it explained. They could not earn money and finish preparations at the same time. The season would not wait for them to do both. "Silas left something," she said. Thaddeus looked up. "The cabin." More than the cabin, Eleanor led him outside and around to the back of the structure. Tucked under a lean cover of planks and stone protected from weather, but accessible, Silas Mercer had stacked what most careless people would have mistaken for scrap. Eleanor knelt beside the nearest pile and ran her hand along the wood. "These are not scraps." Thaddeus crouched beside her. He picked up one piece and examined it. Square split tamarack, stove billets, seasoned hard and dry. He checked another stack. Wagon brace timbers cured straight with no twist in them. A third pile held bundled ash hoops for snowshoes bent and tied in matched sets. Every piece had already spent months becoming what the market would pay extra for. "This is not firewood," Thaddeus said slowly. "No." Eleanor stood and brushed bark dust from her hands. "This is labor stored in wood." Thaddeus understood immediately. Ravens Creek always ran short of dry brace stock and ready billets when late fall came. Men waited too long, then paid for another man's foresight. Silas had known that. He had prepared not just for his own survival, but for trade. "He left us time already invested," Eleanor said. "We can sell this and buy what we need without you leaving the work here unfinished." Thaddeus looked at his wife with new appreciation. She had not just found the cabin entrance by reading the land. She had recognized the deeper system Silas had built. The man had not simply survived alone. He had created a sustainable cycle. Cut wood in summer, season it through fall, trade it when winter made it valuable, use the proceeds to buy what could not be made by hand. Eleanor had seen that pattern and understood it could save them now. "I'll load the wagon," Thaddeus said. "We'll load the wagon," Eleanor corrected, "and I'm coming to town." At the yard, Gideon Brask inspected each piece by hand. He was a man who bought materials with the expression of someone unimpressed by nearly everything. He tapped grain lines, checked straightness by eye, pressed fingertips into cut faces to judge dryness. He said almost nothing during the inspection. Silence from men like Gideon often meant approval. When the tally was done, he named a price. Thaddeus started to accept. Eleanor spoke first. "That is fair for unseasoned stock. This wood has been cured for 18 months. The wagon braces alone are worth half again what you offered." Gideon looked at her with the flat attention of a man deciding whether to be offended or intrigued. "You know timber. I know value. Eleanor met his eyes without aggression, simply stated fact. My husband hauled this down the mountain. I know what it cost in time and effort. You know what it will sell for when the first snow closes the high roads and men realize they waited too long. A slow smile crossed Gideon's face, not friendly, respectful. Your husband ought to let you negotiate more often. Eleanor did not smile back. My husband is wise enough to recognize when I know more than he does about a particular subject. Gideon revised his offer. It was better. Eleanor accepted. They left with enough for good flour, smoked meat, salt lamp oil, a small packet of fever powder, and a roll of waxed cloth that would matter later more than anyone yet knew. On the drive back up Bramble Ridge, Thaddeus glanced at his wife. You enjoyed that. I did not enjoy it. I respected it. Eleanor adjusted the parcels in her lap. Gideon Brask is not a generous man, but he is an honest one. When you prove you understand value, he respects that. You made him smile. I made him recognize that we are not desperate fools. We are people who understand what we have. When they returned to the cabin, Eleanor unpacked the supplies with the methodical care of someone who had been poor long enough to know that waste was a kind of theft from your future self. The flour went into a sealed container elevated off the floor. The smoked meat was wrapped and hung from the highest beam where air could circulate around it. The fever powder was placed on a shelf near the lamp oil, accessible but out of reach of curious children. Everything had its place. Every place had its reason. Thaddeus watched her work and understood something he had known but never quite articulated. Eleanor did not simply manage a household. She engineered survival, one small decision at a time. That afternoon, while Thaddeus worked on reinforcing the doorframe against the coming cold, Eleanor made a decision. She took Willa by the hand and walked down the slope toward the nearest section of ridge trail. Not far, just far enough to learn what lay beyond their immediate hollow. Caleb wanted to come. Eleanor told him to stay and help his father. The boy needed to learn men's work. Willa needed to learn something else. They walked for 20 minutes before Eleanor saw what she was looking for. Smoke rising from a fold in the ridge about half a mile south. Not a large plume, just the steady thread of a cooking fire, tended by someone who knew how to burn wood without waste. Eleanor followed it. The cabin she found was smaller than theirs and built entirely above ground, but it sat in a natural dip that protected it from the worst wind. A woman worked outside, splitting kindling with the efficient strikes of someone who had done this task 10,000 times. She looked up when Eleanor and Willa approached. Her face showed neither welcome nor suspicion, just the neutral evaluation of a person deciding whether visitors meant trouble. I'm Eleanor Brennan, Eleanor said. We moved into Silas Mercer's cabin 3 weeks ago. The woman set down her hatchet. Martha Keene. Heard someone had taken that place. I came to ask if you would teach us. Martha's eyebrows lifted slightly. Teach you what? Eleanor glanced down at Willa, then back to Martha. How to live on this ridge without forgetting we're part of the world. My daughter needs to see how mountain women manage. I need to know we're not alone up here. Martha studied Eleanor for a long moment. Then she looked at Willa, who held her red cloth in one hand and her mother's hand in the other. You asking for charity or trade? Trade, Eleanor said firmly. I can mend. I can preserve food. I can read weather and land. I can offer work for knowledge." Martha nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Come inside." The interior of Martha's cabin was smaller than theirs, but arranged with the same practical efficiency. Everything served multiple purposes: a table that doubled as a work surface, shelves that held both food and tools, a bed that stored firewood beneath it. But what struck Eleanor most was the sense of inhabitation. This was not just shelter. This was a life being actively lived. Martha poured water from a kettle into 2 cups. She gave Willa a piece of dried apple. Then she sat across from Eleanor and spoke plainly. "Ridge gets lonely if you let it. Most folks who try living up here either leave after the first hard winter, or they go strange from too much silence." She sipped her water. "Trick is building a network before you need it." "What kind of network?" "There's 5 families within 3 miles of here, that winter over regular. 6, if I count you." Martha leaned forward. "Ruth Dawson to the south with 3 young ones and a cabin built just last spring. The Hadleys east of me with grown sons who trade labor. Old Henrik north near the high spring. The Cobb family over the western ridge. We help each other when help is needed. We trade what we have for what we lack. And we stay out of each other's business unless invited." Eleanor leaned forward. This was exactly what she had hoped to find. Not just a neighbor. A guide to the invisible map of human survival in hard country. Martha continued. "Who trades labor for flour? Who can watch stock in emergencies? Which trail usually remains passable after first snow? And which one lies about it?" "I want in," Eleanor said. Martha smiled for the first time. "Figured you might. Woman who walks up here to ask for teaching instead of waiting to be offered is the kind who makes it." She paused, studying Eleanor's face, with the practiced eye of someone who had seen enough women to recognize certain signs. "You're carrying, aren't you?" Eleanor blinked. "I'm not." She stopped, counted days in her head, felt a truth settle that she had been too busy to notice. Martha's smile widened. "I've seen that look enough times to know it. You're about 6 weeks along near as I can tell. Morning sickness hit you yet?" "I thought it was just the altitude change." "It's not." Eleanor sat very still. A 3rd child. In a hidden cabin. On a mountain ridge. With winter coming. Terror and joy fought for space in her chest. Joy won by the smallest margin. Martha reached across and squeezed Eleanor's hand once. "You'll be fine. Ridge is a good place to raise children, if you know what you're doing. And you strike me as someone who knows." Willa looked up at her mother. "Are we getting a baby?" Eleanor pulled her daughter close. "Yes, we are. Will it like my red cloth? I think it will love your red cloth." Martha stood and moved to a shelf. She pulled down a jar of preserves and a small crock of rendered tallow. "Take these. You'll need the fat for sealing, and the preserves will help with the sickness when it comes." Eleanor started to protest. Martha held up a hand. "Not charity. Trade. You said you can mend. I've got a coat that needs patching and 2 blankets with holes. Bring them back repaired and we're even." Eleanor accepted the items. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Winter up here is not kind to pregnant women. You're going to need more than preserves to get through it." But Martha's eyes were not unkind when she said it. They were the eyes of someone who had survived enough seasons to know what was coming, and respected Eleanor enough to be honest about it. When Eleanor and Willa returned to the cabin, Thaddeus knew immediately that something had changed. His wife carried herself differently, more settled, less tense. "You found her," he said. "I found her, and more than her. I found a network." Eleanor explained about the 5 families, the system of trade and mutual aid, the invisible map of survival that people who live through winters together created without ever writing it down. She mentioned Ruth Dawson by name, the woman with 3 children in a new cabin to the south. Then she told him about the baby. Thaddeus set down the tool he was holding. He crossed to his wife and placed both hands gently on her shoulders. "Are you certain?" "Martha Keene is certain. And now that she said it, I know she's right." Thaddeus pulled Eleanor close, not saying anything, just holding her while the magnitude of it settled over both of them. Caleb looked up from where he was shaving a peg. "Is Mother sick?" "No," Thaddeus said. "Your mother is giving us another reason to make this place work." Eleanor stepped back and wiped her eyes quickly. She had not realized she was crying until Thaddeus's shoulder was damp. "We have work to do," she said. Her voice steadied. "More work than we thought." Over the following days, the cabin changed, not in structure, but in atmosphere. Eleanor moved through the space with new purpose. She was not just preparing for winter anymore. She was preparing to bring a child into this place in the deepest cold of the season. That meant everything had to work perfectly. Every seal had to hold. Every system had to function without failure. She became more particular about how supplies were stored, more insistent that Thaddeus finish the drainage work completely instead of adequately, more focused on learning from Martha every skill that might matter when snow closed the ridge and help could not arrive for weeks. Martha came to visit 3 days after their first meeting. She brought the coat and blankets that needed mending. She also brought information. "Storm's coming," Martha said. "Not the first snow, not yet, but a cold rain that will test your seals and show you where problems hide." Eleanor nodded. "We fixed the corner drainage. Did you check the window seams?" Eleanor had not. Martha walked her through it, showing her how to test for drafts using a candle flame, where the flame-guttered air was getting through. They found 2 small gaps. Martha showed Eleanor how to mix clay and dried grass into a paste that would seal better than mud alone. "Your husband knows building," Martha observed, "but you know homemaking. Both matter up here. Most couples fail because they think one is more important than the other. Thaddeus does not think that way. I know. That is why you will make it." When the cold rain came 2 days later, it arrived exactly as Martha had predicted. Heavy, persistent, searching for weakness, but the cabin held. The corner drainage worked. The window seals Eleanor had reinforced kept the drafts out. The chimney drew clean even when the wind shifted. Thaddeus stood at the door, watching water sheet off the stone shelf above them without touching the cabin itself. Silas knew what he was doing, and now we know what we're doing, Eleanor added. She placed one hand on her belly, still flat, but carrying a secret that grew more real each day. This child will be born in a place that holds. But even as the cabin proved itself, Eleanor understood they were not finished preparing. Winter would bring challenges rain could not test. deep cold, heavy snow, isolation measured in weeks instead of days. And before any of that arrived, they needed one more trip to town. Flour, lamp oil, salt. Small things that become large things once roads close. Thaddeus rolled the wagon forward one morning to grease the wheel hubs before daylight fully broke. That was when Eleanor saw it. She had been carrying water from the barrel to the cabin when her eye caught on the brake mechanism. Something about the angle looked wrong. She set down the water bucket and knelt beside the wagon. There, a crack in the brake bar. Not a dramatic split. Not the kind that announces itself with noise. A narrow fracture running through the stress point where downhill weight would bite hardest on a sharp turn. The sort of damage that waits politely until the worst possible moment to finish braking. Eleanor called Thaddeus over. He examined it and went very still. "If it fails on the descent," he said quietly, "we lose control in the stone curves above the ravine. And if we delay the trip, snow could close the decision for us." They looked at each other across the wagon. Two people who had learned that survival often balanced on the edge of small things noticed or overlooked. Thaddeus sat on the stone step outside the cabin. He did not speak. Not in surrender. In reckoning. Eleanor understood what he was feeling. Years of labor. Careful choices. Long hours done right. Yet still one overlooked weakness. One small hidden flaw could threaten the entire arrangement. She left him alone with his thoughts. Some battles needed silence more than comfort. Caleb stood a little way off, watching his father with grave attention. He had once thought courage meant not feeling fear. Now he saw something different. A man could feel the full weight of danger sit beside it and remain. He could let panic pass through first. He could wait until thinking returned. When Thaddeus looked up at last, his eyes moved from the broken bar to the stacked brace timber behind the cabin, then to the tools Silas had left, then to his wife. "I can fix it," he said. Eleanor nodded. "I know you can." Thaddeus did not patch the brake bar like a desperate man. He rebuilt it like one who intended to trust it. He chose a length of dry brace stock from Silas's carefully cured supply. Tight grain, no twist. He measured the load angle against the wagon frame, marked the bite points, then split and shaved the piece until it seated clean. The hand auger turned slow through wood. Each spiral of shavings dropped to the ground in perfect curls. From Silas's old tool chest, Thaddeus drew 2 iron straps and heated them enough to bend true. Nothing rushed. Bad repairs often move quickly. Good ones move in order. Eleanor brought Caleb to watch, not to help, to witness. "Your father is teaching you something now," she said quietly to her son. "Watch how he thinks before he acts. How he chooses the right material instead of the closest material. How he tests each piece before committing to it." Caleb nodded. He had his father's serious eyes and his mother's careful attention. The combination would serve him well. By noon, the brake bar sat fast, iron-bound, fitted to the road it would face rather than the one it wished for. Thaddeus rolled the wagon forward, tested pressure twice, then nodded once to himself. "We leave now," Eleanor said. It was not a question. They made it to Ravens Creek just ahead of the season's first real cold snap. Frost still rimed the ditches, but No snow yet blocked the grade. At Gideon Brask's yard, Thaddeus set the wheel and locked the rebuilt brake on the slope beside the scale. He wanted Gideon to see the work, not for praise, for the simple satisfaction of showing competence to a man who recognized it. Gideon examined the repair without comment. Then he looked at Thaddeus and gave the smallest nod. That nod meant more than a dozen compliments from lesser men. With the money from their previous timber sale and what remained of their savings, Eleanor moved through town with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what was needed: flour, rendered fat, salt, lamp oil, nails, a bundle of thick cloth, and small necessities that keep winter from becoming uglier than it must. Then she added one more item: a packet of early bean seed. Plain, cheap, easy to overlook. Thaddeus saw her slip it into the supplies and said nothing until they were loading the wagon. "Bean seed," he said, "for spring." "For spring," Eleanor confirmed. "We have not survived winter yet." Eleanor turned to face her husband. Her hand rested on her belly. Not obviously, just a small gesture that carried enormous meaning. "We are not just surviving winter, Thaddeus. We are building a homestead. Those are different things." Thaddeus looked at the packet of seeds, then at his wife, then at the wagon loaded with supplies that would carry them through the hardest season. He understood what she was saying. The seeds were not optimism. They were intention. A declaration that this family would be there when thaw came. That they would plant. That they would grow. That the hidden cabin was not a place to merely survive, but a place to build a life. "You are right," he said simply. "They are different things." The wagon climbed Bramble Ridge heavy with supplies and evening light. When the hidden hollow finally came into view, Eleanor felt something shift that had nothing to do with grade or wheels. Weeks earlier, they had driven there because nowhere else remained. Now they were driving back because it was their place to return to. And inside the wagon, beneath flour and oil and all the practical necessities of survival, lay a small paper packet promising that the family intended to be there when spring arrived. Eleanor looked back once toward Ravens Creek, now invisible beyond the ridgeline. The town had mocked her decision, had called her foolish, had predicted failure. Let them predict. Let them mock. She would prove them wrong one season at a time. One child raised strong. One harvest planted and gathered. One winter survived not through luck, but through the frontier wisdom passed from her mother's hands to hers. The cabin appeared between the stone shoulders, low, dark, waiting, but no longer strange, no longer uncertain. Home. Thaddeus guided the wagon through the narrow seam. Caleb and Willa climbed down and ran inside, their voices echoing off stone. Eleanor remained on the seat a moment longer, one hand on her belly, the other holding the packet of bean seeds. She had found the entrance by reading the land. She had recognized Silas's system by remembering her mother's teachings. She had built community by seeking it instead of waiting for it to find her. And now she would raise 3 children in a place that the world had called impossible, not because she was stubborn, because she understood what most people had forgotten. That survival was not about avoiding hardship. It was about preparing for it so thoroughly that when hardship arrived, you were already 10 steps ahead. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon and walked into the cabin that would shelter her family through the winter to come. Behind her, the first stars emerged over Bramble Ridge. Ahead, the fire waited to be lit. And in her pocket, the bean seeds promised spring. Winter arrived the way old-timers had warned it would. Not with gentle snow falling from a gray sky, with violence. Wind turned hard 3 days before the first real accumulation. It came from the northwest, exactly the direction Nolan Pike had named months earlier, when he thought he was offering a warning to people too foolish to heed it. Eleanor stood at the cabin door and watched the sky darken. Not the soft dark of evening, the bruised dark that meant weather was gathering itself for a fight. "How long?" Thaddeus asked from behind her. Eleanor tilted her head, reading the air the way her mother had taught her. The pressure in her ears, the way sound carried differently, the smell of stone and pine sharpening as moisture built. "Storm hits tonight. Lasts 3 days, maybe 4. "You're certain?" Eleanor turned to face her husband. Her belly had started to show now, a small curve barely visible beneath her dress. 3 months along. Not obvious yet, but present. "My mother could predict weather 3 days out without fail. She taught me the signs, I'm certain." Thaddeus nodded. He had learned not to question Eleanor's reading of the natural world. She had been right too many times. They spent the remaining daylight in preparation. Thaddeus brought in extra wood and stacked it near the hearth where it would stay dry and accessible. Eleanor checked their food stores, calculating portions for extended confinement. She filled every container they had with water from the spring before it froze. Caleb helped his father secure loose items outside. Willa stayed with Eleanor, watching her mother move through the cabin with methodical purpose. "Are we going to be trapped?" the girl asked. Eleanor knelt down to her daughter's level. "We are going to be safe. There is a difference." "What difference?" "Trapped means you have no choice. Safe means you prepared for what is coming." The first snow began falling just after dark, soft at first, almost gentle. Then the wind found it. What had been falling became driving. What had been gentle became vicious. Snow did not drift down from above. It attacked sideways, propelled by a wind that had gathered strength over miles of open ridge. Eleanor lay in the bunk that night, listening to the wind test every corner of the cabin. Beside her, Willa slept with the red cloth tied to the frame above them. In the other bunk, Caleb had finally drifted off after an hour of wide-eyed listening. Thaddeus sat near the fire, feeding it small pieces to keep the warmth steady without wasting fuel. He glanced at Eleanor. "You should sleep. So should you. One of us needs to watch." Eleanor rose and moved to sit beside him. "Then we both watch. The baby will demand sleep soon enough. Right now, I need to know what this storm is doing to our home." They sat together through the deepest part of the night. The wind howled against the stone shelf above them, but the sound was different from what Eleanor had expected. Not the full-throated roar of weather striking flat and hard. More like wind being broken and scattered before it could reach them. Silas's design was working. The stone pocket was doing what it had been built to do, catching the worst of the storm and deflecting it past the cabin instead of through it. By morning, snow had piled deep on the exposed ridge. But at the entrance to their hollow, the drift was lower than Eleanor had feared. Thaddeus took the shovel from its peg inside the door and cleared the opening before burden could become blockade. He did this every few hours for 3 days. No complaint, no drama. Just the steady work of a man who understood that small problems prevented became large problems avoided. Eleanor managed everything inside. She rationed the fire to keep warmth constant without depleting their wood supply too quickly. She measured out food in portions that would stretch if the storm lasted longer than expected. She kept the children occupied with small tasks that made them feel useful instead of trapped. Caleb learned to shave kindling to exact sizes. Willa sorted dried beans by color, then by size, then by both. Simple work, but work that taught patience and attention to detail. On the second night, the wind changed angle again. It struck the hollow harder than before, searching for entry with the persistence of something that had been denied too long. The smoke in the chimney hesitated, drew sideways instead of up. For a moment, Eleanor thought it might spill back the way it had weeks earlier. But Thaddeus was already moving. He adjusted the damper, fed the fire differently, changed the airflow by opening the door just slightly to create a better draft. The smoke recovered, found its path, rose clean again. Eleanor watched him work and felt the deep gratitude that comes from partnership. He had learned to read the cabin's moods as carefully as she read the weather's. Together they could manage what neither could handle alone. But on the morning of the third day, the real test came. Eleanor heard it before she saw it. A deep crack followed by a sliding sound that made her stomach clench. She moved to the door. Outside, part of the snowbreak Thaddeus had built months earlier had collapsed under the weight of accumulated drift and wind pressure. Not the whole structure, just one section. But that section had been holding back a significant amount of snow. Without it, powder was starting to fill the entrance to their hollow faster than one person could clear it. Thaddeus was already outside, shovel in hand. But Eleanor could see the mathematics of it in his movements. He was working hard, working smart, but working alone against accumulation that was winning. She turned to Caleb. "Put on your coat and hat. You're going to help your father." The boy's eyes went wide. "Mother, You are 8 years old. You are strong enough to hold a shovel. Your father needs help. I need you to give it to him." Caleb looked at Willa, then back to his mother. Eleanor softened her voice. "Your sister and I will be fine inside. But your father will not be fine if that entrance seals. Go." It was a hard decision, sending a child out into a storm, risking him to save all of them. But Eleanor had learned from her mother that hard decisions were often the only real choices available. The question was not whether to make them, but whether to make them early enough to matter. Caleb dressed quickly and went outside. Through the partially open door, Eleanor watched him take a second shovel and begin working beside Thaddeus. The boy's strokes were not as strong as his father's, but they were steady. And two people working together could accomplish what one person could not. Eleanor closed the door most of the way and returned to the fire. Willa looked up at her with frightened eyes. Is Caleb going to be safe? Eleanor pulled her daughter close. Your brother is doing what needs to be done. That is the safest thing any of us can do right now. Outside, father and son worked in rhythm. Thaddeus showed Caleb where to throw the snow so it would not blow back, how to pace himself so strength would last. when to stop and catch breath before exhaustion set in. The lesson being taught was not about shoveling snow. It was about endurance, about reading your own limits, about working past fear, without surrendering to recklessness. By midday, they had cleared enough that the entrance was passable again. Not perfect, but sufficient. When they came inside, both were exhausted. Eleanor had hot water ready. She wrapped Caleb in a blanket and made him drink slowly, while warmth returned to his extremities. Thaddeus sat heavily on the bench, too tired to remove his wet coat immediately. Eleanor helped him with it. "You kept us safe." "We kept us safe," Thaddeus corrected. He looked at his son. Caleb did a man's work today. The boy's face flushed with pride and exhaustion in equal measure. That night, the wind finally began to ease. The snow continued, but without the driving force behind it. By the fourth morning, the storm had passed. Thaddeus cleared the entrance one final time and stepped outside. What he saw made him call for Eleanor. She came to the door, Willa on her hip. The exposed ridge showed snow piled high and twisted, drifts that had formed and reformed in the shifting wind. But the space before their entrance, while burdened, remained passable. More telling was what Eleanor could see farther down the ridge. Through gaps in the trees, smoke rose from only 3 of the 5 chimneys she knew. 2 families had either left before the storm or were burning no fires inside. "Martha," Eleanor asked. "Her smoke is there." Thaddeus pointed. "But Ruth Dawson's is not." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Ruth lived alone with 3 children in a cabin that was newer than theirs. Newer often meant less tested, less proven. And Martha had mentioned Ruth's cabin had been built just last spring. "I need to check on her," Eleanor said. Thaddeus started to protest, then stopped. He knew his wife. When Eleanor decided someone needed help, argument was wasted effort. "I'll go with you," he said instead. "No. You need to finish securing the snowbreak and make sure nothing else failed during the storm. I'll take Caleb. He knows the way to Ruth's place from when Martha took us there last month." It was true, but it was also Eleanor's way of teaching her son another lesson. That capability meant responsibility, that those who survived had an obligation to help others do the same. Eleanor and Caleb set out an hour later. The snow was deep but not impossible. They followed the ridge trail, breaking through drifts where the wind had piled them. When they reached Ruth Dawson's cabin, Eleanor saw immediately what had happened. The roof had partially collapsed on one corner. Not enough to destroy the structure, but enough to make living inside dangerous. Snow had come through the gap, filling part of the interior. Ruth stood outside with her 3 children, all of them looking lost and cold. When she saw Eleanor, relief broke across her face like sunrise. "Mrs. Brennan." Eleanor moved quickly to assess the situation. The children were underdressed for extended exposure. Ruth herself looked like she had not slept in days. "How long have you been out here?" "Since yesterday morning when the roof gave way. We tried to stay inside, but snow kept coming through. I moved us outside before the whole thing came down." Eleanor looked at the cabin. The damage was significant, but not catastrophic. With proper work, it could be repaired. But not while snow still lay heavy on what remained of the roof. She made a decision. "Gather what you can carry. You and your children are coming to our cabin." Ruth started to protest. "I cannot impose." "You can and you will. Eleanor's voice carried the authority of someone who had already calculated the mathematics of survival. My husband can shore up your roof once the snow melts enough to work safely. Until then, you need shelter. Your cabin is not large enough for 7 people. It will be large enough because it must be. Eleanor turned to Caleb. Help Ruth gather essentials. Blankets, food, anything they cannot replace easily. We leave in 20 minutes. The boy nodded and moved to help. Eleanor surveyed the damage one more time, committing details to memory so she could explain them to Thaddeus. Then, she began organizing Ruth's children, speaking to them with the calm certainty that made frightened people believe safety was possible. They made it back to Eleanor's cabin by late afternoon. Thaddeus saw them coming and understood immediately what his wife had done. He said nothing about the imposition. He simply began rearranging the interior to accommodate 4 additional people. The bunks would sleep. The children squeezed together but warm. Ruth could have the bench near the fire. Eleanor and Thaddeus would make do with blankets on the floor until better arrangements could be made. That night, 7 people ate a meal stretched across more mouths than it had been prepared for. Eleanor managed it by adding water to make soup, by stretching bread thin, by serving portions that were smaller, but supplemented with preserves and the careful rationing of stores she had built. No one went hungry. No one was turned away. Ruth's youngest daughter, barely 4 years old, sat next to Willa. The 2 girls whispered to each other in the way children do when they find kindred spirits. Ruth watched Eleanor move through the cabin with quiet efficiency and finally spoke what she had been holding back. You saved us. Eleanor paused in her work. I did what frontier women do. We help each other survive. Not all women would take in 4 more mouths with winter still heavy and their own family to feed. Eleanor met Ruth's eyes. My mother taught me that survival alone is not worth much. Community survival is what matters. That truth settled over the cabin like a benediction. For 3 more days, Ruth and her children stayed with the Brennans. The cabin was crowded. Privacy was impossible. Patience was tested. But no one complained. The children learned to share space and resources. The adults learned to coordinate around each other without collision. And Eleanor learned something about herself she had not fully known before. She could lead, not just her own family, but others. She could make decisions under pressure that kept people alive and functional. She could carry the weight of responsibility for more than just those who shared her blood. On the 4th day, Thaddeus and Caleb went to Ruth's cabin and shored up the damaged roof. It took most of the day and all the spare timber they had. But they made it weatherproof enough for Ruth to return with her children. When the families parted, Ruth embraced Eleanor. I will not forget this. Good, Eleanor said simply. Because next winter it might be us who need help. And I will expect you to remember. Ruth laughed, but her eyes were serious. I will remember. 2 days after Ruth left, visitors came up the ridge trail. Eleanor saw them first. 2 men on horseback moving carefully through snow that had started to consolidate, but still required attention. Nolan Pike and Gideon Brask. They had come to inspect damage along the ridge, to see which families had made it through and which had not, to assess what the storm had done to the cabins people thought would hold. Thaddeus met them outside. Eleanor came to the door, Willa beside her. Nolan dismounted and studied the entrance to the hollow. The snow break that had partially failed but ultimately held. the shielding stone above. The entrance that remained passable despite everything winter had thrown at it. He ducked inside without asking permission. The cabin was warm, dry. The fire burned steady. Supplies still lined the shelves. Children played quietly in the corner. Everything spoke of a household that had not merely survived, but had maintained order through chaos. Gideon followed Nolan inside. He looked around once and grunted approval. For him, that was high praise. But it was Nolan's face that showed the real transformation. The mockery was gone. The skepticism had died. In its place was something Eleanor had not expected to see: respect. He looked at Eleanor directly. "I came to see if you needed rescue." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "As you can see, we do not. Your roof held. It did. Your family is whole." "They are." Nolan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the thing that must have cost him pride to speak. "I told you a woman could not lead a family through winter up here. I was wrong." Eleanor did not smile, did not gloat. She simply nodded acknowledgement. "You were measuring by the wrong standard." "What does that mean?" "You judge by strength, by what men do with their hands and backs. But winter up here does not care about strength alone. It cares about preparation, planning, the kind of household wisdom that keeps a family fed and warm when the snow piles deep." Gideon spoke for the first time. "She's right, Nolan. You were looking at the walls. She built the life inside them." Nolan's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. After a moment, he asked to speak with Eleanor outside. They stood in the snow, the two of them, while Thaddeus and Gideon remained inside with the children. Nolan was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I lost my wife 15 winters ago, and my daughter with her." Eleanor said nothing. She waited. "They died in a cabin that looked safe. Big, well built, visible from the road so folks knew we were there. Everything a family cabin should be." His voice roughened. "But the man who built it did not understand weather. The chimney looked proud rising high into the sky. But when the wind turned hard during a blizzard, the draft reversed. Smoke filled the cabin while they slept. By the time I found them the next morning," he stopped, could not finish. Eleanor waited through his silence with the patience of someone who understood grief required space. "I have spent 15 years, Nolan continued, believing that any family who went into the mountains was making the same mistake I made. Trusting appearance over function, choosing pride over preparation. And now," Eleanor asked quietly, "now I understand there is a difference between building for show and building for survival. Your great-uncle Silas knew that. Your mother knew that." He looked at Eleanor with something close to pain in his eyes. "You know that." "My husband also knows that," Eleanor said firmly. "This is not my victory alone." "No," Nolan agreed, "but it is yours to lead." He pulled something from his coat pocket, a small leather pouch. "Seeds," he said. 6 varieties. Spring planting stock. Better than what you can buy in town." Eleanor took the pouch. "Why?" "Because I mocked you when you bought those bean seeds before winter. Called it foolishness under my breath. But you were right and I was wrong. A family that plans for spring before surviving winter is a family that understands what homesteading means. Eleanor held the seed pouch carefully. "Thank you." Nolan nodded. "I'll spread word in Ravens Creek." The Brennan cabin held. The family thrived. Anyone else thinking about moving to the ridge should come talk to you first. Not my husband. Your husband can teach them how to fix a broken wagon. You can teach them how to survive winter without breaking. Nolan's expression softened. That is the harder skill and the more valuable one. He mounted his horse. Gideon followed suit. Before they left, Nolan looked back one more time. "I said a woman leading her family into wilderness would end only one way. I was right about that. It ends with the woman proving every doubter wrong." Then they rode down the ridge trail and disappeared into the pines. Eleanor stood alone in the snow for a long moment, holding the seed pouch and feeling the weight of what had just happened. Not vindication. Something deeper. Recognition that the wisdom her mother had passed to her was not just survival knowledge. It was leadership knowledge. The kind that built communities instead of just sheltering individuals. When she went back inside, Thaddeus was waiting. What did he say? Eleanor set the seed pouch on the table. He said we were right. About what? About everything. Winter's grip slowly loosened on Bramble Ridge. Snow melted in stages, revealing ground that had been hidden for months. The ridge trail became passable. Neighbors ventured out to visit each other and trade stories of how they had survived. Eleanor's belly had grown more pronounced now. 4 months along. The baby would come in late spring. Martha had calculated. April or May, when the worst of the cold had passed, but before the heat of summer made labor unbearable. But before the baby came, before spring fully arrived, there was still winter to finish. Eleanor moved through the cabin with the careful deliberation of someone who understood her body was doing double work now. Building a child while maintaining a household. She did not slow down so much as become more intentional about which efforts mattered most. Martha visited twice more before the deepest cold arrived. Each time she brought knowledge Eleanor stored away like provisions. How to recognize when labor was beginning in earnest versus false starts. What herbs could ease pain without harming the baby. How to position herself when the time came. What signs meant she needed help versus what was normal struggle. "You'll do fine," Martha said on her last visit before the worst of winter set in. "Your mother raised you right. You know how to listen to your body. That's half the battle." By late January, the world had narrowed to the stone pocket and the 4 walls within it. Snow lay deep enough that travel beyond the immediate hollow became difficult without snowshoes Thaddeus was still finishing. But the cabin held. The systems worked. The family remained whole. Eleanor taught Willa and Caleb in the evenings by lamplight, reading from Caleb's worn primer, numbers scratched into a board with charcoal. Stories Eleanor remembered from her own mother, about how to read weather and land. The children grew stronger in the close quarters instead of weaker. They learned patience. They learned to work together on small tasks. They learned that home was not just a place, but a set of behaviors that made survival possible. February came with deeper cold but clearer skies. The sun returned weak but present. Snow began its slow retreat. By early March, the ridge trail was passable again. Martha came to check on Eleanor and declared both mother and baby healthy. Another month, maybe 6 weeks. You'll know when it's time." Eleanor nodded. She had felt the baby moving for weeks now. Small flutters at first, then stronger kicks. The life inside her making itself known. She stood in the small plot of ground behind the cabin that Thaddeus and Caleb had cleared of rocks and roots back in the fall. The earth was still frozen, but Eleanor could see where it would soften first, where the stone shelf's protection would create the first warm pocket. She held the bean seeds she had bought before winter, and the seeds Nolan Pike had given her, and seeds Martha had contributed from her own stores. "Soon," she whispered to the frozen ground, "soon we'll wake you up." March became April. Snow retreated to shadow in high places. The spring arrived cold and wet, bringing water where snow had been. And then, on a gray morning when rain pattered steady against the cabin roof, Eleanor felt the first real contraction. Not the practiced tightening she had felt for weeks. Something deeper. Something that announced itself with certainty. She was making breakfast when it came. Her hand went to the table for support. She breathed through it, counting the way Martha had taught her. Thaddeus looked up from oiling a harness. "Eleanor, it's time," she said simply. He was on his feet immediately. "I'll get Martha." "Not yet. These are just beginning. We have hours still." Eleanor moved to the bench and sat carefully. "Take Caleb and Willa to Martha's place. Tell her labor has started. She'll know when to come." Thaddeus hesitated. Leaving his wife seemed wrong. Eleanor read his face. "I need you to do this. The children should not be here for this, and Martha will need time to gather what she needs. Go now. The walk will do you good." He nodded. Caleb and Willa were dressed and ready within minutes. The children understood something important was happening, even if they could not name it exactly. "We're getting the baby?" Willa asked as Thaddeus bundled her into her coat. "Soon," Eleanor said. "Very soon." When they left, Eleanor moved through the cabin preparing. She laid out clean cloth Martha had told her to save. She made sure water was heating. She checked that the cradle Thaddeus had built sat ready near the hearth. The contractions came in waves, stronger each time. Eleanor timed them by the movement of light across the floor. 2 hours passed. Then 3. Martha arrived as rain turned to drizzle. She came through the door carrying a leather bag and the calm authority of someone who had done this many times before. "How close?" she asked. 5 minutes apart, maybe less." Martha set down her bag and washed her hands thoroughly. "Good. You're doing well. Let's see how far along you are." The examination was quick and professional. Martha nodded. "Still have a way to go, but progressing normally. First babies take their time. This is my third. First baby born in this cabin," Martha corrected with a small smile. "The cabin makes it different." The labor lasted through the afternoon and into evening. Martha stayed close, guiding Eleanor through each stage. When to breathe, when to push, when to rest between contractions. Thaddeus returned once to check on Eleanor. Martha sent him back to stay with the children. "She's doing fine. Better you keep Caleb and Willa calm than pace around here making her nervous." As the sun set and lamps were lit, Eleanor felt the final stage beginning. The urge to push became overwhelming. "Now," Martha said. "When the next one comes, give it everything." Eleanor bore down, once, twice, 3 times. And then the sound she had been waiting for, a strong cry that filled the cabin and announced new life. Martha worked quickly, cleaning and wrapping the infant. She placed the baby in Eleanor's arms. "A girl," Martha said. "Healthy, strong, perfect." Eleanor looked at her daughter and felt something she had not felt since her own mother died. Connection to a chain that stretched backward through generations and forward into futures she would never see. "Her name is Ada," Eleanor said. "After my mother." "Ada Brennan," Martha repeated. "She'll need to be strong with a name like that." "She will be strong because she'll learn what it means to prepare to endure and to build." When Thaddeus returned with Caleb and Willa the next morning, he found Eleanor sitting up in the bunk, nursing Ada, looking tired but triumphant. Willa approached slowly, eyes wide. "Is that the baby?" "This is your sister," Eleanor said. "Her name is Ada. She was born in the cabin your great-great-uncle built. On the mountain your grandmother understood. In the home we made together." Caleb reached out one finger. The baby gripped it with surprising strength. "She is strong," the boy observed. "She is a Brennan," Thaddeus said. "Strength is her inheritance." For 2 weeks, Eleanor recovered while the cabin adjusted to its newest member. Ada slept and nursed and cried with the rhythms of newborns everywhere. The family learned to work around her needs, finding new patterns that accommodated 4 children instead of 3. Martha visited twice to check on both mother and baby. Both were thriving. By the 3rd week, Eleanor was moving around the cabin again with Ada in a sling against her chest. The baby slept there while Eleanor worked warm and close. And then on a morning when spring had finally convinced the ground to soften, a wagon appeared at the entrance to the hollow. A young couple with 2 small children. They looked exhausted, frightened, hopeful in the way people become when desperation is the only fuel left. Eleanor met them at the door, Ada sleeping against her chest in the sling. "I'm Eleanor Brennan. This is my husband Thaddeus. Welcome to Bramble Ridge." The young woman looked at the baby. "Is it safe to have a baby up here?" Eleanor smiled. "It is safer to have a baby in a place you have prepared properly than in a town where you cannot afford to stay. Come inside. We will show you what we have learned." Over the next hours, Eleanor walked them through the cabin, showed them how Silas had designed the chimney, how the stone pocket protected from wind, how drainage had to be managed, how supplies should be stored. She did not make it sound easy. She made it sound possible. "The mountain will test you," Eleanor said. "It will find every weakness. But if you prepare thoroughly and work together, you can meet that test." The young husband looked at Thaddeus. "Is what she says true?" Thaddeus nodded. "My wife understands this land better than any man I know. If she says it can be done, it can be done. But only if you listen to what the land tells you, and only if you let go of pride about who should lead." The young woman understood what he meant. "Your wife leads." "My wife knows what needs knowing," Thaddeus said simply. "I know what needs doing. Together we survive." Eleanor showed them the garden plot where seeds were just beginning to emerge as tiny green shoots. The beans she had bought before winter. The seeds Nolan had given. All pushing through earth towards sun. "We planted these before winter ended," Eleanor said. "Not because we were certain they would grow, because we intended to be here to tend them if they did. And if they do not grow, the young wife asked, then we learn what does not work and try something different next season. That is what homesteading means: learning, adapting, continuing. When the young family left that evening, they carried with them not just information, but something more valuable: the understanding that frontier life was not about individual heroism. It was about careful observation, humble learning, and the willingness to build on the wisdom of those who came before. That night, after the visitors had gone and the children were asleep, Eleanor stood at the small plot where green shoots were emerging. Ada slept in the sling warm against her mother's chest. Willa came to stand beside her. The girl had been quiet all day, watching the new family, listening to her mother teach. Without speaking, Willa reached up and untied the red cloth from where it hung on the peg Eleanor had installed near the cabin door. The strip of fabric that had comforted her through the journey from Raven's Creek, through the first strange nights in the cabin, through the storm. She walked to the garden plot and knelt down. With careful hands, she tied the red cloth to a small stake Thaddeus had placed to mark the first row of beans. Eleanor watched but said nothing. Willa stood and brushed dirt from her hands. It was mine when I needed it to be mine. Now it marks where we're growing, because this is home. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She had worried about many things during their time on the ridge. Whether they would stay warm, whether they would have enough food, whether the children would grow strong or suffer from the isolation. But she had not worried enough about whether the children would understand what home meant. Willa had just shown her they understood perfectly. A home was not the walls. It was what the people inside the walls chose to build together. Thaddeus came to stand with them, Caleb at his side. The four of them looked at the garden plot with its small green shoots and the red cloth marking their intention. "We did it," Eleanor said quietly. "You did it," Thaddeus corrected gently. "You led us here. You read the land. You built the community. You brought Ada into this world. I just helped you make it real." Eleanor smiled. "Then we are both right." That night, with Ada sleeping in the cradle beside their bed and Caleb and Willa in their bunks, Eleanor lay awake thinking about the journey that had brought them here. From the eviction notice in Raven's Creek to this moment standing in a garden with her family whole and her third child sleeping peacefully. The town had mocked her decision, had called her foolish, had predicted failure. But Eleanor Brennan had led her family into a hidden cabin when the world said it was impossible. She had read the land when others saw only stone. She had built community when isolation threatened. She had managed crisis when chaos came. She had earned respect not by demanding it, but by demonstrating competence repeatedly. And she had brought new life into the place that had once been just a shelter, and had become, through work and wisdom and the passage of seasons, a true home. The hidden cabin had been called a death trap, a snow grave, a fool's shelter. But when winter came to judge what was built wrong, to punish what only looked good from a distance, to expose every weakness hidden by pride or ignorance, that cabin had kept the fire burning, kept the children warm, and kept a family whole through the season that breaks the careless. And in doing so, it had proven what Eleanor's mother had always known: that true shelter is not built for those who watch from the road. It is built for those who understand that weather and wisdom are the only judges that matter. The rest is just noise made by people who have never faced the mountain's test. Eleanor closed her eyes and let sleep come at last. Outside, stars wheeled slowly across the sky above Bramble Ridge. Summer would bring new challenges. Another winter would come eventually and test them again. But tonight, the Brennan family slept in a home they had earned. In a place that belonged to them, not because a deed said so, but because they had proven themselves worthy of it. And that was the only inheritance that truly mattered.